Did he finally kick the hornet's nest one too many times? Hey everybody, welcome to After Action Report, your recap show for all Schmodown matches to keep you caught up on all the action. I'm your host Megs, here for the Call to Action podcast channel, today breaking down the stats and storylines from Friday Night Titans episode 14, where we got to see another double teams match card where we saw one with high energy, the other with a bit higher intensity. We also saw a contract signing leading up into next week's match, which escalated very quickly. But before we get to that, there is a lot more to talk about. In our first scene, Drew walks in to talk to Ben, wondering what happened to what they talked about with Ben building up the league, and what he's doing is the opposite of that. Ben dismisses Drew having any say in what he does. This was his plan all along and brings up things that happened seasons ago. As Drew is confused on what is happening, in comes Dan, further dismissing Drew and his decision to hide on the desk. Ben and Dan send a disappointed and confused Drew out of the room. So this is the scene I hoped we would get. It's the follow-up to Ben and Drew's conversation earlier in the year after the team action match, where Drew finally gets to confront Ben about the complete 180 that he did from their agreement that Drew thought they made at the beginning of the season. And we see Dan further adding on that he still apparently has a chip on his shoulder, so time will tell what happens between the three of these guys. And did you happen to catch, or this just might be my own headcanon, that Dan was almost threatening that if Drew ever came out from behind the desk to compete, that Dan would challenge Guy to a Guy Merle 2. How crazy would that be? I have my thoughts on what that kind of match could mean for both of their legacies, but would love to hear your guys' comments if you caught that and or if you agree that that would be a really cool match to see. We move on to see that JTE can't believe that they are on Titans every night. Preston assures him that he and Adam have a plan to get them to the belts. Adam comes in and announces that they got a match against the System for the main event tonight. JTE and Preston are both a little worried about facing that tough of a team, but Paige steps in to assure them that they got this. So JTE apparently wants to be in the spotlight every night, but balks a little bit when he gets faced with the possibility of facing a heavy-hitting team. Now, both of these teams are at 1-0, so they are both looking at bumping up that record to a 2-0, which would set them on a path to potentially get to a number one contender shot. But before we get to this main event, we have to talk about the undercard for this event, which were two new teams with Pure Energy, consisting of Beth May and Rick Hahn, facing off against the next chapter, which was Moose Haas and Rachel Silvestrini. Coming out of round one, the next chapter is up by 5, 20-15, with Moose Haas getting a perfect round but not getting the bonus. Rachel is just behind him with 9 points, Rick Hahn with 8 points, and Beth May with 7. In round 2, the next chapter defers to have Pure Energy spin first. They decide to take the wild card on their first spin, and it ends up being the new category, Talking Animals in Movies. They come away with 8 out of 10 points, checking down to multiple choice twice, but not giving away any steal opportunities. The next chapter spins away from Richard Donner and ends up taking Nicole Kidman. They come away with 7 out of 10 points, checking down to multiple choice twice, misses one of those questions, and it is stolen for 1 point worth of steals. This gives Pure Energy a gain of 2 points, but the next chapter is still up by 3, 27-24. In round 3, Rick hits his 2-pointer in Wrestlers in Film, but Beth misses her 3-pointer in Musicians in Film. So I'd love to hear your guys' comments on what you thought of this miss by Beth May. She is such a fun ball of energy that you can't help but love her and her just boisterous energy. But the fact that she just blurts out Schindler's List for a hook, I'm sorry, that is got to be one of the most hilarious wrong answers. I would even put it up with some of JTE's answers, which we know are legendary. Now, this miss does force Pure Energy to have to answer their 5-pointer, which is in Marvel, and they do miss this, and this gives the next chapter the win via TKO, with a final score of 27-26, where Pure Energy answered 22 of 29 questions for 76% accuracy and scored 61% of 43 available points. The next chapter answered 24 of 26 questions for 92% accuracy and scored 84% of 32 available points. So I'd love to see your guys' comments on this match. I personally really enjoyed watching this one. Pure Energy is another one up there with the Wildberries, Brewery Jacks, where they get some answers correct, but in reality, and for the most part, they are just happy to be there and are going to have fun answering the questions that they can. Guesses on how many calories Beth May burned during the entirety of that match. There was a lot of bouncing around, a lot of high energy coming from her specifically. I bet she burned quite a few. And another thing we can pull from this is for their first time competing together in the teams division, the next chapter with Moose Haas and Rachel Silvestrini put up some pretty impressive numbers with above 90% accuracy, a potential points earned up into the 80s. Granted, they didn't have to answer anything in round 3, but just overall, knowing that Moose Haas played in the IG division last year to making his first bout into the teams division and getting a perfect round the first time out is pretty impressive to be sure. So time will tell if these guys get to make a little bit of a run here in this season, but absolutely, I think all of us will be more than happy to see Pure Energy come back and get more of that little jolt of energy that we might all need on any given week. So this takes us to the midpoint in the event, and after our commercial break, we have one quick final scene before we get into the main event. Kaiser and Smets hear that Janine wants to give the database a new look. There are several failed attempts at this, but Janine finally presents the one. So huge props to production and the editing team on this scene in particular, because this felt the most like a movie scene as any other scene that we've seen so far in this season. When we get into the match itself, you see that the getup that is chosen for the database is a play on Neo from the Matrix, which very much falls in line with having a machine, a database, and the team being called the System. Leave comments with your thoughts on his new look. Speaking of, we are now to our main event with the Movement facing off against the System. Coming out of round 1, the Movement is up by 1, 18-17, with Paul Preston going perfect but not hitting the bonus, Database hitting 9 points, and both Janine and JTE coming away with 8 points. I will make more comments on this at the end of the match recap, but this was the point in which we saw the challenge against JTE for his spelling of Billy Bob Thornton during the famous actors and actresses question in this round. But moving into round 2, the Movement defers to the System to spin first. They spin away from Brat Pack, end up taking the wild card, which turns out being a new category, movies involving weddings. They come away with 9 out of 10 points, checking down to multiple choice once, but don't give away any steals. The Movement spins away from Queen Latifah. They end up taking Brat Pack. They come away with 8 out of 10 points, checking down to multiple choice once, misses that question, but it is not stolen. So that gives the System a gain of 1 point to where they are now tied at 26. In round 3, the Machine hits her 2-pointer in Sly and Arnie. This sends it back over to the Movement, where Preston hits his 2-pointer in Harrison Ford. Back over to where the Database hits his 3-pointer in Comic Book Movies, and JTE hits a 3-pointer in Martin Scorsese. This sends it back to the System for a 5-pointer in Comedy, which they miss, and this gives the Movement the win with a final score of 36-31. Where the Movement answered 25 of 29 questions for 86% accuracy and scored 86% of 42 available points. The System answered 24 of 29 questions for 83% accuracy and scored 72% of 43 available points. Now, I've been seeing a lot of discussion about that challenge there in round 1, and upon my review of the match, again, I do see that Janine also did spell Thornton incorrectly. But if the other team didn't catch it, you can't pull out another challenge after a final ruling has been determined. And I understand that people can get frustrated about this when we can see and super hyper analyze everything that's going on, but It's also the exciting part about this being a live gameplay scenario type event because, yeah, sometimes things slip by and human error is definitely a part of any real sport. So, again, it's this beautiful blend of the theatrics with the storylines that are fabricated, but you also have a real sport like mentality during the actual games itself. And this is part of why I absolutely have loved this sport and this game ever since I found it. So, as was stated in the post match interview, this match sets up several different possible teams matches coming up. With the system and the appointment now being 1-1, we could possibly see Janine face off against Mr. Irwin once again in a teams match, and that also once again pitches the dungeon up against the stars. But on the other side, we also have Coast to Coast, which are a 2-0 team, possibly being able to face off against the movement, which themselves are now 2-0, which that could set up a possible title run for either one of these teams leading up into the teams tournaments coming in later on this season. Before we sign off, we see the contract signing between the boss and Mike, with Kate and Shannon also being present. Ben makes some disparaging comments about Mike and makes a pitch at Shannon to look him up if she wants to play with a real singles player. That sets Mike off, and he has to be pulled off by Shannon and Christian. Christian sends Mike and Shannon out of the room, with Ben and Kate having the time of their lives. Now, we saw that Shannon did warn Mike to not let Ben get in his head, and what happens? Ben gets right in underneath his skin and sets Mike off into a fit. And I gotta say, what is it with Ben Bateman, the boss, and physical altercations inside the MTS? I've counted 4 or 5 instances where either indirectly or directly, the boss has been involved in physical altercations inside of an MTS match. What's going on? You had the famous tackle where Guy was the one doing it, but Ben was right there with him and supporting him. You saw that Guy tackled Ben through a table, and Ben, in response, hits Drew with a chair. In Chicago, Roxy slaps Ben across the face in front of 1,000 people. Earlier this year, Saul even came after the boss after the Dan Murrow reveal, and now this most recent altercation with Mike now makes 6 total counts of physical altercations involving the boss. Now, we do know that technically Ben had the right to void the contract and to not play Mike because he put his hands on him. But in reality, that's actually exactly what the boss wanted to happen, and there was no way he was going to miss that match for anything. Now, the question is, did this have the desired effect, and is Ben now fully inside of Mike's head heading into this match? Or did the boss go too far this time, and he will end up facing a vindictive Mike that is out for blood in the main event for next week's Friday Night Titans? And that's going to do it for this week's episode. But don't worry, I'll be right back next week covering all the stats, all the storylines for next week's episode. I don't think you're going to want to miss it, so stay tuned. Before you leave, make sure you have hit like on this video, you are subscribed to the channel, and leave comments with your thoughts on the episode. The match breakdowns presented here will be posted on Twitter and Facebook. Until next time, for the entire Call to Action podcast crew, I'm your host, Megs, and this is After Action Report, signing off.